Chapter 22, From Isolation to Empire. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the United States transitioning from a nation that was primarily preoccupied with the United States to a nation that was an imperial world power. Isolation or imperialism. So in the decades after the Civil War, most Americans were concerned with building an industrial economy and with expanding westward. In other words, filling out the frontier. Americans turned their attentions to European affairs sometimes, but we didn't, by and large, spend a lot of time in European affairs because we had faith in the political and moral qualities of the Republic. And so that accounted in large part for our disdain of, or at least disinterest in, European affairs. But America was beginning to display an intense and a growing interest in Latin America and the Far East. There were some instances, convinced that European actions might threaten the United States' interests, where Americans responded, and they responded with a swift hand. Origins of large policy. So, again, in the years after the Civil War, America very slowly and hesitantly began to make steps toward global policies. And the United States purchased Alaska and the Midway Islands, which is equidistant between the Pacific coast of North America and Asia. And so that provided sort of a small foothold in the Pacific Basin. And in addition to that, there were attempts to purchase or annex the Hawaiian Islands, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and, successful or not, it signaled a growing interest in the outside world. And so by the late 1880s, the United States had begun an active search for external markets, and basically markets for their agricultural goods and industrial goods. When the frontier was finally closed and when all the land had been occupied or pioneered, many Americans looked to overseas expansion, taking on new land outside of what we already had. And so intellectual trends even added impetus to this new global outlook. And there's Anglo-Saxonism, missionary zeal, and of course the example of European imperialism that opened American eyes to the possibilities that existed within expansion. And so on top of that, military and strategic arguments justified a large policy toward an empire in the Pacific. So, American interest in the Pacific and the Far East was just about as old as the Republic itself. And the opening of Japan to Western trade increased America's interest in the Far East. And even despite Chinese protests over the exclusion of the Chinese from the United States, trade with China still remains strong. Many were interested by this point in annexing the Hawaiian Islands, and strategic and commercial concerns made the acquisition of Hawaii a very attractive possibility. And, growing trade, commercial ties, there was a substantial American expatriate community in Hawaii. And after 1887, there was the presence of an American naval station. And all of this pointed toward the annexation of Hawaii. So in 1893, the Americans living in Hawaii finally deposed Queen Liliuokalani and sought annexation by the United States. And I'll put that name up here for you. There you have it. The Queen was deposed, and, there was some opposition from anti-imperialists and a couple of special interest groups, but the United States finally annexed Hawaii in 1898. So that's when the annexation was final. toward an empire in Latin America. So in addition to the traditional commercial interests in Latin America, the United States became increasingly concerned over European influence in that region. And, the United States and Great Britain had previously signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850 that said that the two nations would jointly protect the neutrality of Central America, and neither power would try to fortify or exclusively control any future Isthmian waterway. And of course, this was later revoked by the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty of 1901, which essentially gave the United States control over the Panama Canal. But there was tension there between the United States and Great Britain in Latin America. And in 1895, there was a dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain over the boundary between Venezuela and British Guiana, which almost brought the United States and Great Britain to blows. And, there was some talk of war, some rattling of sabers, but really war would not have helped either side. And so finally, Britain was pressed by continental concerns, imperial concerns, and finally agreed to negotiation. And after that, relations between Britain and the United States were warmed considerably. The Cuban Revolution. So Cuba in 1895 was under the control of Spanish rule. And so in 1895, Cuban nationalists revolted against Spanish rule. And Spain's brutal response to them aroused American public opinion in support of the Cubans. And President Cleveland even offered to be a mediator, but Spain refused. But this issue was kept alive in the United States by American expansionists who had interest in taking Cuba, citizens who were sympathetic to Cuban independence, and the press, which at this time was led by Hearst Journal and Pulitzer's World, and they kept this issue alive. There were two events that that catalyzed the war with Spain. The first one was a letter. It's called the Delome letter. And there is one of these guys. So the Delome letter was written by the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Enrique Dupuy Delome. And in this letter, he criticized American President William McKinley by calling him weak. And he said that he was concerned only with gaining the favor of the crowd. And so publication of this letter helped generate public support for a war with Spain over the issue of Cuban independence. And the second thing that served as a catalyst to this war was the explosion of the battleship Maine. And the Maine was lost in the Havana Harbor on the 15th of February, 1898. And the Maine was a U.S. battleship that had been sent during the Cuban revolt against Spain. And it exploded suddenly without warning, and it sank quickly, killing nearly 3/4 of the crew on the ship. And so, of course, the cause and the responsibility for the sinking remain unclear, and McKinley even had a board of inquiry investigate. And nevertheless, even though the explosion, we don't know what caused it, popular opinion in the U.S. was fanned by articles printed in the, quote, yellow press, maybe you've heard of yellow journalism, by Hearst and Pulitzer that blamed Spain. And they threw out the phrase, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And this became the rally cry for action, which came with the Spanish-American War later that year. So more recently, it was figured out that the cause of the explosion was probably the coal, or the kind of coal that was used in the Maine, which was bituminous coal, maybe. I'm not exactly sure how that's said, but it releases fire damp, which is a gas prone to spontaneous explosions. And so most people now think that there was an internal coal fire which ignited the magazines and caused the explosion, but no one knows. So the Spanish-American War. And the year for this is 1898. This was a simple 10-week conflict between Spain and the United States, and it was the result of American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence. Remember, Cuba was trying to gain their independence from Spain. We got involved, therefore war was declared. So, American attacks on Spain's Pacific possessions led to involvement also in the Philippine Revolution and ultimately to the Philippine-American War. But by the late 1890s, American public opinion was agitated by anti-Spanish propaganda, again led by yellow journalists like Pulitzer and Hearst, who used journalism to criticize the Spanish administration of Cuba. And of course, after the sinking of the Maine, political pressures from the Democratic Party and certain industrialists even who pushed McKinley's administration into a war he had hoped to avoid, war happened. And initially, Spain sought a compromise, and the United States rejected. And the United States sent an ultimatum to Spain demanding that they surrender control of Cuba. And so first Madrid and then Washington formally declared war. Although the main issue was Cuban independence, the war was fought in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. And of course, American naval power proved decisive here, allowing U.S. expeditionary forces to come ashore in Cuba against a Spanish garrison who was already brought to its knees by Cuban rebellion and also by yellow fever. Their numbers had dropped dramatically because of yellow fever. And so the United States, or the American forces fighting with the Cubans in the Philippines, were numerically superior, and they obtained the surrender of Santiago de Cuba and Manila, despite the good performance of some of the Spanish infantrymen, and of course fierce fighting for positions like San Juan Hill. So with two obsolete or outdated Spanish squadrons sunk in Santiago de Cuba and Manila Bay, and a third, more modern fleet that was sent back home to protect the Spanish coast, Madrid had no other choice but to push for peace. And so the result was the 1898 Treaty of Paris. Make sure you note the date there, because there are many Treaty of Parises. So the 1898 Treaty of Paris. And the terms, of course, were favorable to the United States. And the terms were simply Cuba gained their independence, but they were under the temporary control of Americans. And then Spain ceded indefinite colonial authority over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So the United States really came out on top of that war as a result of the Treaty of Paris. So we'll pick up in the next video with the United States developing a colonial policy.